Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for your patience. It seems as though you can't really have an honest to goodness meeting without having some sort of technical difficulties. Certainly appreciate your patience. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. Today, we're going to talk, I'm going to talk about looking north, how climate change impacts Coast Guard operations in the Arctic. I've got direct experience with this, and I'm hoping to share and impart on you what I've experienced so that you are, have a better understanding, especially as some of you jump on your summer cruise aboard the, I may say this wrong or right, but the Bodwin, uh, seeing some Arctic villages firsthand. Again, my name is Commander John Downing. I'm Chief of Prevention at Coast Guard Sector Anchorage, an officer in charge of the inspection for Western Alaska and the Arctic, which is delegated down to me from our Coast Guard Sector Commander, Captain Christopher Culpepper. So thank you for including me in today's discussion. I'm very, very grateful to be here. I'll be talking briefly about how we developed what used to be called the Marine Safety Task Force, an innovative solution to basically what I'm going to show you here and demonstrate as operational challenges, mostly to overcome the tyranny of distance, and then highlight how our multi-mission nature of the Coast Guard and how we were able to effectively and successfully conduct missions throughout the U.S. Arctic. And then while many of these challenges still remain, hopefully with each passing year, we can work to overcome them and better provide service to U.S. citizens throughout. Okay. You all see the polar bear there. The biggest question we have is, how much does a polar bear weigh to break the ice? Okay, so now that I'm done with the dad jokes, we'll get started. I hope that some of you at least found that funny. Again, a little bit about myself. I am a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. Please don't hold that against me. Class of 2002. From there, I entered into the Navy, and then I saw the light at the end of the tunnel with the Coast Guard, and I transitioned over with a stint in between working for Military SEALs Command, operating in the Arabian Gulf. I just 2 weeks ago completed or had my 20th anniversary of military service, so it's a good place to be. And I definitely highlight a little bit more about the Coast Guard a little bit later. But right now, as I said, I'm Chief of Prevention. I lead 83 personnel assigned to the prevention departments at the sector, including 4 subunits, including 2 marine safety units, a marine safety detachment, and an aids navigation team. Our area of responsibility is the largest in the Coast Guard. We have a 39,000-mile coastline and rivers in Western Alaska and the entirety of the U.S. Arctic. We have 2 international borders, both on the Canadian side and the Russian side. We oversee a $10 billion fishing industry, 8,000 vessels which transit the Great Circle route in the Northern Pacific, 210 federally recognized tribes, and that's in our sector alone. You're going to see a slide later that has more, but that's our entire 17th Coast Guard district. We oversee the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and Terminal. We have regulatory authority over that. And then the crux of a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking to you about today involve the 380 regulated facilities. The Coast Guard has a lot of missions. We're a military multi-mission and maritime service. We're a unique force that carries out an array of civil and military responsibilities touching almost every facet of the U.S. maritime domain. We function as part of the Department of Homeland Security under 14 U.S. Code, which includes law enforcement roles and missions. Keep in mind that we operate under a different department than the Department of Defense under posse comitatus laws, because we enforce laws on U.S. citizens that DoD cannot. We may be transferred in parts or in whole to the Department of Navy when war is declared by Congress or as directed by the President. We perform national defense, maritime safety, security, stewardship roles and missions, and our forces normally integrate into the national response framework and remain under the operational control and administrative control of the Coast Guard to execute our statutory missions. And then when we perform our statutory missions, we may be supported by DoD when they're conducting their missions to support civil authorities. In this slide, I've highlighted the 2, the marine environmental protection and marine safety, as you can see here. These are the 2 missions that I primarily oversee at Sector Anchorage. Now, all the rest of these missions are vitally and crucially important, but today when we talk about the effects of climate change and what we see and how we overcome it, these are the missions that we're conducting when I show you what we encounter. We do conduct all these missions up in the 17th Coast Guard District. Ice breaking and ice operations are actually pretty crucial to what we do. Okay, So when I say that our AOR is pretty big, this is the largest AOR in the United States Coast Guard. So as you can see, it includes the entirety of Western Alaska and then the entirety of the U.S. Arctic up here. Now, the definition of the Arctic I'll go over here shortly, but it actually encompasses a lot more than just this area here. One of our subunits is Marine Safety Unit Valdez, which is located here, and they have this Captain of the Port OCMI zone here in Prince William Sound. And then in Juneau, where our 17th Coast Guard District office is, there's the Sector Southeast Alaska, which has this smaller AOR here. So throughout the district, we have 2,500 active duty reserves, auxiliaries, and civilians to support our area, encompassing 3.8 million square miles and 47,000 miles of shoreline throughout Alaska and the Arctic. And just to give you some stats, during an average month in the 17th district, the Coast Guard will save 22 lives, assist 53 people, report and investigate 25 marine casualties, perform 74 living marine resource boardings, respond to 22 pollution incidents, service 93 buoys and fixed aids to navigation, 13 security boardings, 22 security patrols, 143 commercial fishing vessel safety exams, save over 1.65 million in property, teach 375 kids about life jacket wear, and perform 95 marine inspections. One of the items that I do want to highlight is the complexity and tyranny of distance, and I can't put stuff nor explain this enough. If I just showed you one slide of how big Alaska really is, and we moved on, at the end of the show, you'd probably still be scratching your head as to why what we're doing in the Arctic is so difficult. So I'm going to have numerous slides kind of highlighting the size of Alaska just to prove my point, so that you can take away with you what the Coast Guard does and how we can see climate change impacting all of these villages and how we can work to overcome it with limited resources and limited capabilities to get those resources up there. Conducting operations in Alaska is like planning and overseeing operations from Georgia, staging equipment in Texas to conduct operations in North Dakota, moving people and equipment from Kodiak to Barrow, also known as Utqiagvik, is approximately equal to moving from North Texas to the North Dakota, Minnesota, Canada border. And so we've got a very unique area. Coast Guard is the lead agency for the following activities throughout the Arctic. We improve Arctic domain awareness. We sustain federal capability to conduct maritime operations in ice-covered waters. That's why the Coast Guard has icebreakers and ice-breaking capability. We improve hazardous material spill prevention, containment, and response. And what I'm going to go over with you today in this show is going to highlight some of those challenges that we've had to overcome. And bear in mind, a spill in Alaska means a lot more than just a standard spill in the lower 48. We promote Arctic oil pollution preparedness, prevention, and response internationally. So what that means is that up until recently, we worked very closely with Russian authorities to gauge and partner and run drills on how we spills in international waters. And we still currently do the same with Canada. We enhance Arctic search and rescue. Again, we would work very, very closely with Russian authorities to do the same. And then we'd still work with Canada quite extensively to enhance Arctic search and rescue, which is something a lot of people don't think about, especially as cruise ships tend to go up into the Arctic more and more. Search and rescue capability up there is not quite the same as it is off, say, the coast of California or Florida. We implement and enforce the international code for ships operating in polar waters, i.e. the polar code. So these are regulations that must be implemented on board ships who are operating in polar waters to make sure that they have the capability to conduct firefighting, for instance. If they don't have the proper hoses or connections, those can easily freeze up and then they wouldn't be readily available if a fire were to break out on the vessel. And that's just one example. There's a lot more to the code than just that. And then lastly, we promote Arctic waterways management, which is crucial to getting our job done. One of the items under the waterways management is the port access route study, which, as you can see by my pointer here, we need to be able to have a route all the way up through and then over the Arctic into Canadian very safely and in an area that's agreed upon, that's not going to impact or cause problems with hunting grounds for whales and other species that are traditional foods of the villagers who live there. One item too I want to point here is this little line here goes right in between two islands, Little Diomede on the U.S. side and Big Diomede on the Russian side. And there's going to be a slide later where I'm going to highlight that. Um, but this is kind of the place where you can literally see Russia from your backyard, and I'll show you that too a little bit later here. Okay, the Port of Anchorage is crucial to the survival of all Alaskans. Every single Alaska receives 90% of their goods from the Port of Alaska, so 90% of what's in Alaska comes in through the port here. And as you can see from the distribution, goes all the way to these other hub and spokes, including Barrow, Kotzebue, Nome, Bethel. These are all areas that we also service communities out of. But once it gets into Anchorage, then it's either sent by train up north to Fairbanks or via air to these other communities. The airport is also fluctuates between being the third or the fourth largest cargo airport in the world. It's very highly strategic. It's approximately 9 hours from every single city in the globe via air, and a lot of routes taking the Great Circle route will stop at Anchorage to refuel, pick up cheap gas, and then move on to the rest of their deliveries. When I say it's crucial, I can't emphasize enough just how much of a lifeline the Port of Anchorage is to the entire state. So this is the Alaska road system. So oftentimes, again, people will say, well, why can't you just drive up to Nome, or why can't you just drive up to Barrow, Utqiagvik? The reason being that there's no road that exists. The ones in red here are actually paved roads, and then the ones in blue are dirt roads. This is the world famous Dalton Highway, which goes from Fairbanks all the way up to Prudhoe Bay. It's one access to the Arctic Ocean that a lot of people have via vehicle. It's very, very arduous to drive. It's not the easiest. And so when we think about the size of Alaska, you got to think also to the infrastructure in Alaska. It just isn't the same that it is down in the lower 48 or in other countries throughout the globe for that matter. The other aspect to this is that up until 2018, the Coast Guard was really only primarily servicing, and when I say servicing, I mean conducting inspections and exams on facilities and vessels that were located here where the red road system could take them, all the way up to Fairbanks. So all the villages that are on the outlying coast that also have waterfront facilities and commercial fishing vessels, as well as some commercial vessels delivering goods, the Coast Guard was not in attendance and just never went up there because the cost to get there was just way too high and way too difficult. So often the question arises, what is the Arctic? Well, the answer depends on the context of the question. The traditional definition of the Arctic is the Arctic Circle, parallel of latitude, 66.5 degrees north of the equator. And some of the communities north of the Arctic include Kotzebue, Wainwright, Fort Yukon, Dead Horse, Prudhoe Bay, Point Lay, Point Hope, Barrow, Utqiagvik, and Kaktovik. And then for us, for the Coast Guard, for the purposes of our funding, we use the Arctic Research Policy Act definition so as a starting point. If the regulatory activity occurs on or within a vessel or facility that operates seaward of the ARPA line, or if a prohibited spill originates from the regulated facility or vessel, and it could reasonably impact seaward of the ARPA line, it's an authorized Arctic mission activity. So oftentimes here, when I'm saying that we conduct Arctic missions, it's in that area that's highlighted there. We utilize this to basically ensure that we have enough funding to do our work. So as you can see, this little area here on the globe, this is the globe looking top down. This is the top of Alaska, bottom of Alaska, and then this entire region here. So we've extended, this is the standard definition of the Arctic. We've extended it down to also include Nome, get closer down here. And then we've also included all of the Aleutian Island chain here. So when I send personnel out to conduct Arctic work, I can use Arctic funds to send them to all of these locations. And I know you're probably sick of me touting this, but Alaska's huge. And this is just another example of just how difficult it is to send people anywhere. So the distance from Kodiak up to Utqiagvik is from like flying from Oklahoma all the way to the top of Minnesota. And then the expanse of the entire of the U.S. Arctic, or of Alaska, actually stretches way over the length of the United States. Alaska is about a fifth of the size of the United States overall. And in other words, what I always tell people is you can fit California, Florida, and Texas in there combined, and you still have plenty of room for lots of Rhode Islands to go in there. Okay, now we're getting to the crux of what we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. So, tribal relations. Throughout Alaska, there are 229 federally recognized tribes, and they're all living near coastlines. What that means is that they're all living near areas where they can conduct traditional hunting and fishing activities. They're the majority populations outside of the city areas, which include Anchorage or Matsu. That's just the northern valley north of Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. Now, when we say here that the Coast Guard's uniquely present, what that means is that even though there's a lot of federal activity throughout Alaska, DoD activity with forts, with bases up in Fairbanks, base in here in Anchorage, and then other areas that have various installations, those don't really interact with the community the way the Coast Guard does. And so oftentimes when we go to a community, we may be the only interaction that a lot of these citizens have had with any federal personnel aside from the Postal Service. It's a big deal. It's a big deal to interact with them because each one of these federally recognized tribes have sovereign nations attached to them. In other words, their leadership is just as equivalent to our leadership, i.e. in the executive branch, including the Senate, the Congress, and the Cabinet. So we've been operating in the Arctic Ocean since 1867 when the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. And since that time, the state of affairs in the Arctic has evolved significantly relating to climate change. And we're seeing that ice recedes, storms are increasing in frequency and magnitude, the coast is eroding, and permafrost is thawing. And so today's discussion captures climate-related observations that our Sector Anchorage members who conduct multi-mission operations throughout the Arctic region have witnessed, and hopefully I can relay to you today exactly what they've seen and how challenging it is for us to identify, and then what the logic of the next step is to overcome. So I'll be doing such in talking about the Alaska fishery closures, the Yukiavik tar discharge, Selawik diesel spill recovery, as I mentioned earlier, a little Diomede visit, Lower Kuskokwim School District fuel tank relocation, which is going to really, really highlight beach erosion and why that's happening. Newtok community fuel tank relocation. Well, I'm going to also kind of talk a little bit about the entire community of Newtok being moved. And then lastly, I'll touch on Typhoon Merbok. So Bristol Bay is imperative to not only the U.S. economy, but essentially the global food supply. It consists of salmon in Bristol Bay is 28% of U.S. salmon and exports, which is huge. It feeds a very large swath of the entire country. The entire world. The last 2 or 3 years have had record salmon hauls in Bristol Bay. Now, the reason for this, obviously when there's record hauls, people don't really think, hey, what could be causing this? Well, the climate change is actually impacting salmon runs and how they're moving up and down the coast. So while the Bristol Bay area is having record runs, other areas throughout Alaska are not. So the king crab fishery and the Alaska snow crab fishery, as well as salmon in the northern areas of Alaska, including the Arctic, have not been doing well at all. NOAA released their 2021 survey data. They showed the Bristol Bay District red king crab estimated mature male biomass at 12.5 thousand metric tons, or about 27.7 million pounds. While that's higher than 2019, it's less than half the recent 20-year average, continuing a trend of decline in the region. 50% of the legal-sized males were new hardshell crab, a decline from the 62% of legal-sized males that were new hardshell in 2019. The Bristol Bay red king crab stock, the largest in the state, has been declining for years. Surveys were canceled in 2019 due to the COVID pandemic. And in the last year of the survey, the stock declined and forced managers to cut the total allowable catch by 12% to 3.8 million pounds. The stocks and harvests have been declining consistently since 2013. At the same time, red king crab has remained an incredibly valuable fishery. In 2020, fishermen landed 8.5 million pounds of king crab in the state with an estimated $50.2 million value. And then that number includes all species of king crab, though not just Bristol Bay kings. Moreover, Chinook salmon is basically dying out throughout northern Alaska. Numerous physical and biological factors influence the production and survival of Chinook salmon in freshwater and marine phases of their life cycle. What that means is that as these salmon leave and go into the saltwater and then back into freshwater, for every 100 that emigrate to sea, 4 will return as adults over the next 1 to 5 years, which means that people who rely on this salmon to fill their freezer aren't going to be able to. And people who rely on it for sport aren't going to be able to either. The Bristol Bay fishery, each year they've had these record runs, have been sending salmon up to these communities, but that's not necessarily sustainable. And that's one of the things that really needs to be observed and studied further are the long-term impacts if the salmon doesn't return to these areas. What are these communities going to do for their sustenance? The exact mechanisms behind the increased mortality rates are not known, but environmental conditions such as precipitation, air and ocean temperatures, and water currents, to name a few, are believed to affect the juvenile salmon survival. People are reluctant to point climate change because there isn't a clear solution, but it is probably the actual biggest factor here. Secondarily to that, with the crab stocks that are down, one item I do want to highlight, a lot of the data that I provided is all the way up through 2020 and 2021. In 2022 and 2022, they completely shut down the Alaska king crab season because there wasn't enough, the data indicated there wasn't enough to sustain any fishing. And then in 23, there was limited amounts allowed, but it still was hindered greatly to the point where a lot of fishermen didn't even find it worthwhile to go out and conduct a harvest. Second aspect to this, secondarily, the climate change, or what's oftentimes referred to as the younger brother of climate change, is ocean acidification, which has yet to be further studied throughout Bristol Bay, however, has been impacting the U.S. Pacific Northwest, i.e. off of the coast of Washington and Oregon, for some time, and it's affecting shellfish down there. So the thoughts are that it's also affecting crabs up in the Bering Sea. Now I'm going to talk and shift a little bit over to bulk fuel facility characteristics. In the lower 48, they most people don't even think about where their fuel comes from, right? These are corporation-owned for-profit major facilities, including refineries, that store fuel and then distribute. Oftentimes, when they're larger in size, they'll have an entire environmental compliance staff. They'll have highly trained people on board to not only affect operations and conduct operations, but they'll also be there for security and safety in the event something goes wrong. They don't require a lot of Coast Guard resources to regulate. What that means is that the standard Coast Guard sector in the lower 48 has enough personnel to be able to attend the facilities on an annual basis and conduct exams that are required by law. In addition, they don't necessarily have to jump on a plane to go do these, and they can hop in a vehicle and be at any of their facilities within the matter of, at the most, I would say 3 hours. Whereas for us up here in Alaska, it will take a 6-hour plane ride, as well as costing the taxpayer between $10,000 to $20,000 per trip. Moreover, these bulk facilities are not the single most largest environmental threat in each area. So if you have a fuel farm or some sort of spill, it's not necessarily next to an area where the whole community relies upon that for their protein sustenance, but it's also the cleanup area. The cleanup capability is much more rapid. It doesn't take days and days and days to get equipment up there to conduct those cleanups. And lastly, Coast Guard's ability to regulate is much more enhanced because anytime we would issue a remedial action, i.e. a fine or shutting the facility down, it doesn't necessarily take out the entire town or the village to do that. They're not going to lose their heating oil. They're not going to lose their fuel oil in order for them to go hunt. Now, transition to the Arctic and Western Alaska. We'll have small corporation-owned, operated for profit, but they're beholden to the community. In other words, the community relies on these small tank farms for their fuel for their vehicles, but also fuel for their cooking, fuel for their ability to heat their homes. The owner and the operator they have very little experience. So in other words, what that means is the operator of that same facility could also be the school principal or the school bus driver, because a lot of school districts have oversight over these tank farms, and that's who they have available to operate them. Not to say that they're not competent to do so, but they just don't have the same amount of training that somebody at a more complex facility would have. It requires significant resourcing, as I mentioned earlier. Just the ability for us to get up to these areas is really, really difficult, and it's very, very costly. They are directly impacted by climate change. I'm going to go over some recent spills that we've had and how climate change was the absolute factor, including increased temperatures, soil erosion, etc. If these tanks in the middle of winter have a worst case discharge, that entire community goes without heating oil for the rest of the winter, because you can't just drive a barge full of fuel up because the ice is prohibitive. Moreover, you can't just fly a plane up because, again, the airport may not have access for them to take the fuel. And if they do end up being able to take a plane full of fuel, the cost per gallon is exorbitant. It can raise from $3 to $5 per gallon, all the way up to $20 to $25 per gallon. It's a lifeline. And for us to compel compliance, a lot of this wallowing infrastructure is nearly impossible to use the same tools that we've used in the lower 48. So we work very, very intensely with local tribes as well as the state government to figure out if there's any mechanism to get grants to be able to fund equipment enhancement or to bring more materials up the villages. This is what I said I'd talk about with Diomede. This is Little Diomede, the village on the island, and then this island here is Big Diomede, and that's Russia. So you can literally see Russia from the U.S. 2021 in October, the Coast Guard cutter Kimball paid a community relations visit. They basically got onto the island, met with the leadership. This visit had been coordinated with our District 17 Native liaison. They were ready and they were prepared to meet with the crew, and they were welcomed, and everybody was very, very pleased to see, again, federal entity calling upon the city. One item that came out, though, was that they said, hey, we're having issues with our tank facility. Can you look at it? And the personnel on the Kimball, that's not their job. All of that mission set lies at the sector. So the Kimball referred back to us, and then we sent personnel up there. And we identified that tank had been years since it had been inspected, and they had quite a few deficiencies that needed to be overcome. While both entities were there, both the Kimball and the sector, the leaders expressed concerns about the effects of climate change on their community. The annual hunt does not yield nearly as much as it once did, and even a good year is only a fraction of what it used to be. In addition to the hunting, there's concern over the stability of the town itself, because it's in a cliff or a rock face. That basically a number of the buildings have required reinforcement with jacks due to erosion. And then the part of the rock barrier that protects the town has collapsed. And then they estimate that the entire town slips down about 6 centimeters per year. And basically the chief concern there is also the condition of the fuel tanks. So when we got there, we again noted these deficiencies, which in any typical case would have basically required shutdown of this fuel facility, but that just couldn't happen. Secondarily, security, they also see, having Russia so close, the community on that island who used to be their family had been relocated, and then the island was basically repurposed as a military base. And so when they look over there, oftentimes they'll see military personnel looking right back. And that's something that is of concern, because the security of these, not only the food security, not only the impacts of climate change, but also the international security is something that's really high on their minds when they can see it every day. But the Coast Guard visit inspired confidence and faith in federal support. When my team got there, they noted the brand new American flag was flying, and despite the harsh weather conditions and challenges, the villagers demonstrated that they're proud Americans willing to help. One of the things that was noted is that they subsist off of blue king crab, walrus, seal, and an occasional polar bear. And they harvest those in the winter months, and that when the ice is safe enough to walk around the island. However, for the last 7 years, they haven't had much multi-year sea ice, and the safe ice has reduced as climate change continues. In the summer, they pick salmon berries, Eskimo cabbage, Eskimo potatoes, greens, and grasses to add to their meals, but the water throughout the Bering Strait, there's fast currents making fishing from the shore nearly impossible, and has resulted in some children and adults being swept away when playing in the water or accidentally breaking through the ice in the winter. Some of the village members describe nightmares they have of boulders falling from the top of the island and crushing their homes. And these are all based on the impacts of climate change. Now we're going to shift a little bit north to Yukiavik up here, the beach erosion at Simmons Hill. So once we received an initial report through Facebook, a citizen posted pictures of oil-like substance leaking from steel tanks that were buried on the beach. The investigation determined the tanks were placed there in the 1960s to reduce beach erosion from storms believed to be from airport runway paving project decades ago. So outreach included city, borough, and native corporations. Samples of thick tar-like semi-solid substance had been taken for analysis. And so what this determined is that these tanks had been buried, and then now that the erosion had caught up and broken through, water was getting into them, and then they were discharging oily substances into the water. And so we dedicated $250,000 from the oil spill liability trust funds to remove the discharging tanks. And they pulled out, there was a total of 39 that were placed in there originally, and the Coast Guard was able to pull out quite a few of them. These tanks had been buried for decades until recently, when massive storms had been churning up the waterway quite extensively. More pictures here. They were able to, most of them have been removed and dealt with. But one of the challenges that we had to overcome during this time was the we do with the waste, because there's no way just to take it down and throw it on a ship and get it out of there, especially during the winter months when they don't receive barges, etc. So it has to be packaged up and stored until a cost-effective solution can be rendered. And again, here's some more photos of those. Of that response. Okay. So Wales, Alaska heating oil fuel spill. Sector received notification that an open day tank valve discharged 1,862 gallons of heating oil, and then the discharge recovery was hampered by severe weather and snow accumulation. As of now, we've more than 600 gallons have been recovered, and then we attend, once the winter breaks up and we can actually access these areas, Coast Guard personnel will go and attend. And one thing I do want to highlight here is, as you can see, this person's digging. When a fuel spill happens in the winter in the Arctic, it, on one hand, on one good note, it basically goes into it gets into the snow, and then it's cold and congeals. And so cleanup is almost as easy as scooping up the snow. On the downside, however, a lot of these communities don't have the heavy equipment that you would think they would just be able to take a backhoe or a steam shovel, as you saw in the previous pictures, and be able to dig it out. So they have to do it by hand, which leads me to the next.
Need to leave at 3:50. So, okay. Would you like to reserve a couple questions or time for questions?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for John?
Hello. I was just wondering how political unrest, like we have currently, affects marine pollution response capabilities in the Arctic.
Political unrest as in between us and Russia?
Yes.
So I'm glad you asked. That it has impacted it. One relationship that has remained strong is between the U.S. Coast Guard, our 17th Coast Guard District, and then the Russian Border Guard, which is their equivalent to the Coast Guard. We still do have comms with them. However, what has happened is the ability for us to exercise our capabilities to respond to a spill with them. So in other words, if something happens within that crosses that maritime boundary line, we will not have the established relationships or the pre-established relationships that we once had to be able to coordinate and effect a response. And moreover, there's going to be a lot more blame pushed back and forth and liability pushed back and forth. So one thing that that really is a challenge is trying to get that coordination, because coasties rotate out every 3 years. So any established relationship that you have, you're going to lose. And then if we do essentially lose those relationships, that political capital that we have, it's going to make it so that that response is then going to be delayed by trying to figure out who's who and trying to enact our incident command system to the betterment of basically to that partnership. We do have that strong partnership up with Canada, however. So if anything were to happen up on the Canada boundary line, I think that we'd be in a better position and a better place to affect our resources, to launch our resources, and to share our resources. On the Russian side, it's not to say it won't happen, but I think that the delay will be significant, and what is brought to the cleanup may also be less significant from either side, because they may determine that that particular spill may impact the other side more so. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
That is all the time that we have. But we really appreciate you joining us today.